Welcome to today's Future Stream. I'm Stuart Riddle. I'm your host for today. Just a quick intro before we jump into some questions. I run Knkt Digital. We're a digital product studio that builds products using AI and automation. And we're an inherently curious bunch. We love chatting to people about their take on AI, chatting to leaders and innovators in the space who can really help expand our horizons and, I guess, help us understand what's possible in this space. So joining us today, we've got David Hill, who's CEO of Asia Pacific of Deloitte. And I'll do a quick intro, David, and then we can jump into it. But just running through your bio, you lead about 5,100 partners and 100,000 professionals across 20 geographies in the fastest growing and most dynamic region of the world. Prior to his current role, David served as APAC Deputy CEO and COO, where his focus was on delivering a world-class operating model for Deloitte's operations in Asia. Having been with Deloitte for over 29 years, David has gained extensive international experience across Asia, Europe, North America, and Australia. So David, welcome.
Thanks, Stuart. It's great to be with you.
Good. Looking forward to our discussion. What we're hoping to do today is really dig into some insights from your international experience, discussions you've had with leaders across the globe, really, so we can get a perspective here in Australia on what's happening internationally in AI, and particularly how big businesses are tackling AI. Like, what are they doing? What aren't they doing? Are they tackling it or not? So, yeah, love to hear your take on it, and we've got a stack of questions here that we can run through, and then if there's time, we'll open it up to the audience.
Great.
So, first question, to get your sort of personal take on AI. Like, it's, when you're exposed to what's possible with AI, like, is there anything that sort of grabs you and you're drawn to, or what turns you sort of to focus your attention on it or turns you away from it?
Yeah, I think there's so much that's exciting. I look at what we're doing at Deloitte, for example, just around the generation of code and more efficient use of code. I mean, immediately before this, I was on a webinar talking about sustainability and climate. And I think when you look at, for example, software code, we know that there's anything up to 40% estimates of wasted or redundant code built into software, and Gen AI is just completely cleaning that up, which is fantastic for the environment. We know that, obviously, we'll talk a bit later, I'm sure, that there are environmental challenges associated with Gen AI, but on the coding side, generating code, accelerating software development, improving the code, it's outstanding. But in terms of what's impacted me, certainly spending time with our clients in the health and medical sector in particular. I was with GE Healthcare, for example, seeing what is going on in just one area, so medical diagnostics and imagery, using Gen AI to enhance the ability of doctors, surgeons, radiographers, etc., to identify anomalies and to enhance diagnosis is just awesome. So there's a few areas, Stuart, that are clearly very exciting. On the stuff that's a little more concerning, I think it's fair to say we live today in almost a post-truth world. I'm the father of 3 children. For them to have a concept of certainty about anything today is very difficult, because they're bombarded constantly by what they would perceive as maybe fake news. It's the era of misinformation, malinformation, disinformation. And so, on the concerning front to me is that, clearly Gen AI is adding to that challenge. And we see that playing through in the US election today. And then, as I alluded to earlier, whilst I think Gen AI will help us with some of the environmental challenges we we face today. I'm sure you're aware it's now fairly commonly noted that, one chat is one bottle of water in terms of impact on the environment. So there's a couple of things that are exciting me and a couple that are concerning me.
Yeah. I don't think it's too far off where we're going to get video calls from people that we think we know, right? So
Yeah.
having some tactics around that, I think, is pretty important as a family and as a community.
Yeah. No, you're quite right. I mean, there was a situation recently where a client of ours, there was a fake earnings meeting where a company was reporting on its earnings, and it was done by bad actors who were deliberately trying to short a stock. It's extraordinary, and literally investors and shareholders had no idea what was going on. So, as with everything in life, there's the good and the bad.
Yeah, so true. So taking that sort of interesting perspective in your own world, what about across APAC? Like, what's the vibe in boardrooms? Is there sort of a mixture of that in boardrooms, or what are they sort of concerned about but excited about?
Yeah, I think the observation I'd make around the C-suite and particularly CEOs is that I think there's this really sort of pent-up demand now to move from the era of piloting and experimentation to the core. Everyone's now done a proof of concept. Everyone's done a pilot. Everyone's rolled out a form of a private large language model, or they've embraced an open AI or an AWS platform, etc. But what most CEOs are telling me now is that they want to see that transform their business models, their operating models, their technology stack. I think that's probably point one. Point two is I think there's this desire and a level of impatience to see Gen AI actually flow through to enhance productivity. It holds great promise. I'm reminded that there was a very famous economist, Robert Salau, who said about the emergence of the PC. He was a Nobel Prize winning economist. He said, I see the computer everywhere except in the productivity figures. And what he was bemoaning is it held such promise, but it was not yet delivering in terms of enhancing productivity of at that time, the US economy. And I think a lot of corporates are now saying, I want to start seeing some dividends in terms of productivity and profitability. Probably a couple more, Stuart. Trustworthy aspects. There's a lot of talk now about trustworthy AI. That's an issue in the boardroom. The ESG considerations, sustainability, but also those governance issues that I alluded to, or those social license issues around objectivity. Probably, though, the two most current questions in the boardroom is, what does my workforce of the future look like? What decisions should I be making today around, like at Deloitte, graduate recruitment, lateral hiring in an era of AI? And then the other frustration, I think, for many CEOs of multinationals is, the regulatory environment is all over the place. The EU are leading on regulation. We've got Japan, who are taking a much more hands-off approach to regulation. So it's very difficult, the regulatory landscape at the moment as well. They're just a few points.
And where do we sit? Where does Australia sit in terms of maturity or embracing AI at that level? Give us a sense of sort of where we sit?
Yeah, there's conflicting data. So SAS just put out a report claiming that actually Australia was number 4, just behind in terms of adoption, just behind China, US, UK, Australia. Our analysis, Deloitte just published a very significant piece of thought leadership around Gen AI. We published that in May, June of this year. We interviewed over 11,000 employees and students across the Asia Pacific region, and we found actually quite the opposite. We found there was a 30% higher take-up of Gen AI in the developing countries. So in our research, we found 87% adoption in India, 76% across Southeast Asia, 72% in Taiwan, Singapore, China, 68% in South Korea, whereas Australia was at 54%. And I personally, not because it's Deloitte research, but I think the weight of evidence globally is that that is true. The developing world is embracing Gen AI as an opportunity to leapfrog, whereas in the developed world, we face the incumbency challenge, where people are sort of wedded to existing investments and perhaps more reluctant to experiment and see Gen AI as a way to leapfrog forward.
Yeah, certainly from a leadership perspective, that's a big obstacle to overcome, I think. The kind of baked in mentality around how fast or how slow we can or can't move. So we'll explore that. I saw.
It's
sorry, you go.
Stuart. There's a great little book, if you haven't read it, tiny little book. You can read it in about 45 minutes by a guy called Spencer Johnson, called Who Moved My Cheese? And if you haven't read it, it's a story of these little mice, and whilst there's still cheese, they just go back to the same source of cheese and don't change. And I think the challenge for the developed world is that we've got so many other investments. It's sort of the heuristics of human behaviour. We've got the sunk cost of many investments in other technologies, whereas some of these emerging economies are just embracing Gen AI and going all in.
Yeah, we've got some catch up to do, sort of right from the foundational elements of society, education, and schooling, and just the older generation getting their head across it to be able to sort of direct the next generation in that way. I saw an interview with Robert Hillard from Deloitte recently, and he had some interesting things to say. One of the statements he made was that no one's talking about corporates, no one's worked out how to use it at scale, but companies are using it for very specific use cases to boost productivity or solve a particular problem, which I think aligns with what you're saying. He also explained some of the difficulties around developing with AI at the rate of change that the whole sector's moving at, and said that within 2 years, I'm paraphrasing, within 2 years you're going to have systems that are essentially out of date, which in my experience is any system that you don't actively develop and focus on and grow as the business grows. So you've got sort of the Maximus on one side, arguing that there's massive growth in GDP and the amount of tasks that AI is going to take over in your average worker's day, is going to increase. And Goldman Sachs and Deloitte are in that sort of basket, I think. But then you've got other voices who say quite the opposite. I note Darren Akamoglu from the Institute of he was an institute professor of economics at MIT. He said that, and this was based on some economic theory that he used, that less than 5% of tasks are going to be replaced by AI, and in fact, the impact on GDP globally is only going to be 1 or 1.5%. So you get this sort of very contrasting opinions. What's your take on that? You sort of a maximist, or you're more in between the kind of extremes?
It's still probably a little too early to be too emphatic, but I would probably be a little bit towards the latter, Stuart. I think to me, it's a little bit like the classic hype cycle. We're at the peak of the classic curve. We're at the peak of inflated expectations. Often after that comes the trough of disillusionment, where people understand that actually this has been a little bit overhyped. But then what you find is you get the slope of enlightenment and actual, genuine transformation starts to come through. And then you get that plateau of productivity. And, we know that to be the Gartner sort of hype cycle. And I think that's the challenge we face today. What I say to our staff, right, because there's a mixture of great optimism and fear. The way I describe it, I'll give you an example from last night, mate, and this is a bit embarrassing, but it describes our household. I've got two kids who are mathematicians who both aspire to be engineers, and they're a little bit of, they love this stuff, right? We just had an amazing session around quantum computing, and we know that now, quantum computing is probably 3 years away rather than 10. In terms of some of the very early quantum use cases. But the scary thing around quantum is we know that, for example, the entire internet is underpinned by the RSA encryption methodology using prime numbers and all that sort of stuff, which we won't go into now, but that quantum could actually completely destroy and factorize those primes and really unpack internet encryption or encryption of virtually everything today that is in a virtual or digital environment. And I was chatting to my lads about it. And Eddie, my 17-year-old, goes, well, what is the RSA encryption? And he goes, oh, don't worry. Bang. He just whacked it straight into ChatGPT, got an immediate answer. Then they unpacked the formulas. And it was just so interesting to watch how they discover and learn. Why am I using that example? When I talk to our staff, there is no question that when it comes to finding the answer, ChatGPT has changed the world. Gen AI has changed the world. In terms of finding answers, we will be quicker than ever before. But I'll give you an example that's very real to us at Deloitte. Say one of our most treasured clients, BHP. BHP want to decarbonise. You can find out what BHP needs to do and how they need to do it really fast through Gen AI. You could type in right now, our listeners could, what does BHP need to do to decarbonise? Bang, you get a pretty good answer. But then you've actually got to do it, right? And I think a lot of people forget the do. And so, for example, if you're in the pure advice business, which is relevant to us as professional services, you're at the vanguard. You're in the crosshairs of, it's a short fuse and going to be a big bang if you're purely in the world of providing answers. Whereas a firm like Deloitte, we've moved to the doing, the implementing, the assisting, and then increasingly the operate. So to me, I think it's overhyped for sure at the moment in terms of what Gen AI is capable of, but we would not want to underestimate at all that the way we find answers, receive advice has fundamentally changed.
Mm. And I expect within those conversations, you're really encouraging this kind of combination of precision and creativity. Like that's kind of how we see it. It's like it's all about combining human creativity with that power to do something quite remarkable in a far faster or more powerful or more impactful way than what you have before. And I think if people see it like that, they'll start to embrace it more readily. And then having some use cases that pilot or the experimentation may have sort of proven, the next challenge as a business is then rolling it out at scale, which I think you've done on a few occasions. There's some platforms that you've got internally that are tackling that very problem, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we talk about things like, there's lots of terms, but the augmented professional. We know now it's a hackneyed thing to say. You're not going to lose your job to Gen AI, but you may to a professional enabled by Gen AI. I think that's the sort of approach we're taking. So we've rolled out My Assist, to everyone. I was looking at the statistics this morning. We now have 72% of our staff are actively using My Assist every day. So that's a fundamental shift, and they are therefore, when you talk about the game that we're in with client service, it's speed to outcome, speed to value, and there's no question Gen AI is accelerating speed to outcome, speed to value. My only concern there, and I know there are many other commentators who share this view. I spent a decade on the board of a university, and I just hope that as society we still treasure and value true greenfields research and discovery rather than just brownfield. We must, as a race, continue to, as you said, embrace those uniquely human capabilities of creativity, imagination, courage, empathy, that lead to greenfield breakthrough discoveries. Whereas Gen AI, we know that in reality, it's a bunch of tokens and algorithms that incredibly efficiently sort of assemble existing knowledge, and we can't rest on that.
Mm. Yeah. Excuse me. Agreed. I think the worst case scenario is sort of a vanilla AI future where everything looks the same, sounds the same, you get the same kind of answers from anywhere,
Yep.
and it sort of waters down into this, into this very vanilla future, which is sad. So, we have to do what we can to really sort of inject the human element into that, and backed up with ethical sort of considerations. Really sort of steer the technology. And I think there's some promising signs from sort of government and then industry level to put the right guardrails in place for that. But certainly a very fast-moving space. So it sounds like you've got demand sort of coming from your staff as well as the kind of top-down support or investment needed to really kind of roll out a solution at scale like the MyAssist platform. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. It's both, isn't it? Like if I look at both us and our clients, you've got a lot of sort of executives who are just saying, give me AI, do AI, because they go to events, they listen to podcasts like this, and they come back and say, do AI. So you've sort of got a push down from the C-suite, the executive level, where you've clearly got sort of Darwinian survival of the fittest mentalities, very strong pioneers and drivers who want to be at the cutting edge and competitive. So that's driving it. But you're absolutely right. It's certainly coming from the digital natives that are joining us, who it's fundamental to how they learn, how they execute, how they work. And we've had extraordinary situations where we've had programmers in our firm who have 10, 15 years experience, and we've got young people in their first year who are writing code and building assets faster, quicker, better, cheaper, and it's because they are adept in the new tools. So it's top down and bottom up.
Yep. Yeah, our steer to companies looking to integrate AI into their processes is that if you don't tackle it from a management level, you got to have people sort of pushed under the radar, and you're going to have staff doing, using AI outside of the scope of what you deem sort of reasonable. So either push it underground or embrace it and deal with it, and actually put some frameworks in place to steer it. So.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Just on that, I think the thing that we were all talking about 10 years ago has been lost in the current discussion, and that is that, to me, Gen AI reminds us all that perhaps aside from our employees, our greatest asset is data, and that's been lost in all this. And to your point just now, if we don't embrace it, there's a real risk that a lot of confidential data goes out into, large language models and onto ChatGPT that can create major issues down the track. So that's why at Deloitte we've worked with Microsoft and OpenAI. We host it on the Azure platform. It's a closed loop, and our people can upload documents, upload our content, and leverage that in a safe and appropriate way. And that's really, really important because of our obligation to our clients. But you're right. If you don't embrace Gen AI, it's very hard to stop young people using it, and some of that may not be good in the longer run.
Yeah. Just moving on to kind of the startup style experimentation phase that we alluded to earlier, which a lot of companies are still in that phase. But particularly with the big end of town, you've got big companies that have got massive sort of ERP or enterprise level software projects that are underway and have either failed or have taken a long time to roll out. And there's a lot of sort of C-suite execs who are kind of burnt by that experience potentially and haven't had a great experience. But AI kind of by nature demands that you have a somewhat startup style, kind of fast, agile, experiment, fail, and then move it in a different direction style approach, which is very, very different to the enterprise software sort of approach. Like, how do you see that playing out, particularly in Australia, or are there lessons from overseas that Australian companies can sort of embrace and start to use in their businesses?
Yeah, it's interesting that so there are differences. So when you're in China, so I've recently come back from China. I spent a lot of time in China. They have a expression that in English basically reads like this: China style, China cost, China speed. And if you know anything about China speed, it's lightning fast. They do not let perfection get in the enemy. They don't let perfection be the enemy of progress. That is for sure. So the concept of things like MVPs, minimal viable products, that is embedded in the China mentality. And so I would see, we are steeped in sort of classical software development, alpha, beta, launch, hypercare, etc. That is not the Gen AI way. And so I do see the likes of China, India moving incredibly fast and democratizing access and as a consequence empowering greater outcomes at speed. How do bigger organizations do it? So one of the decisions that I made for us at Deloitte is I wanted to create an environment where, to your point, we captured the ability of every one of us to see the opportunity. I don't need everybody to be, brilliant when it comes to Gen AI, but I need everybody to see the opportunities, right? And so we've embarked on a huge exercise around AI fluency. I would hope, Stuart, that you could interview any one of our 105,000 people across Asia Pacific, and they would be able to talk reasonably informed on generative AI. Why? Because we need to spot for ourselves in terms of our service delivery transformation, but also opportunities at our clients to use Gen AI to enhance their productivity and their speed to outcome. What we then did is we've built a centre of excellence in India. Within a month, we had over 100 people. We're scaling at about 50 or 60 people a month. And what we've done is we fund the Centre of Excellence centrally. We then have almost like an editorial board. So anyone in all of Asia Pacific can come forward with a proof of concept, a pilot, and it gets built for free in the centre of excellence. And so we are moving at phenomenal pace. And I'm really proud that within the Deloitte community, we are the leader in terms of the number of apps and assets and private, small, large language models that we are building and commercializing in Asia Pacific. So that's sort of the way we're trying to do it. Will we be as agile as a startup? No. But do we have, for example, the infrastructure, the route to market, the client base to create incredible commercial outcomes? Yes, we do.
So is this the greenhouse project?
Yeah, so the greenhouse is what often gives rise to the pilots and the proof of concepts, because that's where we sort of brainstorm, work up the proposition in a very innovative environment, and then it goes to the Centre of Excellence for that's sort of the manufacturing side of it, as it were.
Got it. Yeah, okay. It's a good name. I like the kind of idea of nurturing an idea and nurturing a concept into fruition. And then I think the really nice thing about that is that all those learnings can then be kind of focused on a client project, right? That's sure, it's internal, possibly internal projects, but those learnings are sort of make their way into client outcomes.
Yeah, and that's a big point, because you get better at this, right? Because it's expensive. I mean, Stuart, an NVIDIA CGU, I mean, you're talking serious coin. And so we are getting better at assessing the use cases, assessing the business cases. And through utilising our greenhouses, our shop selection is getting better and better.
Yeah, and I imagine that you arriving at that sort of model wouldn't have been the first model that you started at. Excuse me. So, excuse me, in that, I think there's a lesson for business leaders where don't expect to get something right first time. We've certainly had projects where we've gone down a path and had to back out of 3 months worth of work. And we're a small, software agency. So, excuse me, it's not, it's just a different mentality where you have to be prepared to, try again.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And learn. Nelson Mandela's great quote, "I never make mistakes, I just create learning opportunities." It's a good mentality.
Yeah, for sure. With speaking of leadership, there's we've spoken already about how you need to kind of rewire the thinking for business leaders or with business leaders. But how do you see leadership in particular changing with the ability of AI to help with decision making? It can certainly help your organisation adapt quicker based on new challenges or new information. And based on your comment about this sort of mixture of enthusiasm and fear, how are they tackling it themselves? Like, are they upskilling with it, or are they sort of leaving it to their teams to come up and sort of suggest ways to approach this new territory, or like how's that playing out?
Yeah, it's a really great question, because we all know that at the moment we're living in a VUCA world, right? It's volatile, it's uncertain, it's complex, and it's ambiguous. So in a VUCA world, leadership becomes even more important than ever before, particularly to instill a sense of hope, belief, and optimism in our people, right? And as I said before, to extol the virtues of those uniquely human capabilities. And I think what we're doing at Deloitte is doubling down. Like you mentioned, our greenhouse environment. We're doubling down on curiosity, design thinking, imagination, creativity, courage. All of those things as leaders, we need to equip our people to embrace those, because Gen AI is a great leveler And it's those uniquely human qualities which is the layer that will differentiate us, because it's still a race. It's still a competitive world out there. And so we're putting a lot of focus on that. The other thing as leaders is you have to make choices. And Stuart, I'd give you 2 examples that I've just learned really recently. One of the things I'm now talking about at Deloitte, which is a bit of a curious expression, is, in business, everyone knows what's your Mickey Mouse, right? It's a famous thing. What's your unique value proposition? One of the things I'm asking is, what's our dove? Now, you might say, what are you talking about doves for? Well, it's a great little story. Dove, which is the sort of personal hygiene, beauty product, you might call. You would, I'm sure, Stuart, seen some of the billboards. They are all about celebrating the beauty of the human body. Whatever shape, size, whatever, keep it real. That's who we are. So the CEO of Dove came out recently and said, you know what? We are going to embrace Gen AI in our supply chain, in our coding, but we will never use it in any advertising, any campaigning, because we are about the human spirit, the beauty of the human body, and celebrating that. And I just think that's fantastic, because a lot of people are talking about what are we going to do with Gen AI. Here was a CEO that said, based on our values, this is what we are not going to do. And so I'm asking now at Deloitte, what's our dove? What are we not going to do when it comes to Gen AI? And we've already got a pretty good list of that, which I really like. Second, as a leader, every person you lead needs to know that you have their back. And so one of the other examples that I love, and I'm also saying, what's our IKEA moment, right? And the IKEA moment is also an awesome story. IKEA had a particular call centre, 200 staff, which is now no longer required because of the use of Gen AI and now chatbots enabled by Gen AI. So what did they do? Did they make 200 people in the call centre redundant? No, they didn't. What they launched, they retrained those 200 people and they relaunched a virtual interior design service. So those 200 people who used to be call centre people now are assisting in a virtual environment using Gen AI, helping customers design their homes and incorporate the IKEA furniture. So there are 2 examples where I think leadership is so key. At Deloitte, we don't see Gen AI as just taking heads out or taking cost out, but there will be a liberation of hours, right? It will not take the same time to do some things that we used to do in a more manual or labour-intensive way. 2 things. We have an obligation to pass that to our clients. But secondly, we must take the liberated hours and create revenue out of that and therefore opportunities for our people. And as leaders, that's our obligation. The easy thing is just to make those people redundant. And I'm not going to do that.
Love it. Yeah, great point. There's just a third example to add to those 2. There's an iPad app called Procreate, and you get your iPad pencil and you can do some amazing illustrations, some artwork and digital artwork. And the CEO of Procreate came out and he goes, like, we are never introducing Gen AI into our product. It's all about your artwork that you create from your creativity, and that's the stance they took, which I think is awesome. It's like it's aligning your brand with who you are and what you stand for.
Yep.
And if it's all about individual creative expression, then don't go there. And putting that boundary in place is great leadership. It's letting your people know that that's the direction we're taking. And I'm sure there's a whole bunch of ways that they use AI in their business, but not in their product.
Yep. No, it's a great example. I like that. I'll add that to my thinking.
To your repertoire.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a fascinating, I think, aspect of AI. Just where do we stand on it? And what are we doing? But most importantly, what are we not doing? And defining those, I think, is part of leading your business in the future.
Yeah.
I've got a hypothetical kind of dilemma for you to think about, and we've touched on ethics and just thinking about AI in the context of compliance, for example, or governance. But if in the future you've got this incredibly capable AI system that's tapped into your historical records and data and captured the kind of essence of who you are as a business, and it's made that system, that AI system has made a really highly profitable business decision, and it's recommended that you go down a certain track, and you can't fully explain how you got there. There's no real sort of observability or transparency in that process, and it's got to this conclusion using all of its kind of complex algorithms that sit at the back end of it. And shareholders are pressurizing you to act on that because it's got out into the market. How do you balance like those two things, right? You've got this potential for profit, and then you've got the lack of transparency as a leader. So I'm sure this is going to play out in some way, shape, or form in so many companies in the next 5-10 years. And I think this is other sort of scenarios that will shape governance. But like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, look, I think our profession in Australia has, with some of the experience we've been through recently, it's sharpened the way I would respond to that. Personally, it's how I would have always responded. But when you look at a firm, particularly like ours, we are a public interest entity. We act in the public interest. We have a social license to operate, and it goes a bit to that question of what's my dove. I think the answer for us would be a very quick, we wouldn't go there. And the reason I say that is both that sort of sense of ethics and integrity, that you never sacrifice the long term for the short, but also the fact that there is this notion that people have, and I love the way you frame that, because so many people have this notion that AI is somewhat of a magic genie or a black box. But at a place like Deloitte, and as you know, Stuart, very well, really generative AI is, as I said, a very large, as it were, in simple language, like database of extraordinary existing information with algorithms and tokens and weights that assemble that information into responses. And so it actually, there is a responsibility. And when you talk to banks and insurance companies in particular, they feel this very deeply. We have a responsibility to own that, and we must be able to provide rationale and references. And just to share something with you, one of the fastest growing parts of Deloitte at the moment is AI assurance, where, for example, individuals are saying, if you're using generative AI around an insurance claim or whatever, is there bias in that algorithm? We know about hallucination. We know about the infamous, Google Cloud moment with the bias that was built in. And so Deloitte has a trusted brand. We are an audit brand. We provide a lot of assurance as well as all of our consulting, M&A and advisory services. But clients are now turning to Deloitte to say, we want you to assure our algorithms so we can go to customers and say, we can confidently reassure you around the integrity of these outcomes. And so we would never compromise, because otherwise it would completely destroy that opportunity for us to provide assurance to others. So, but it is a big point, and there will be operators. There are operators out there who are profiteering from that kind of stuff. You see it particularly in some of the capital markets, in options and short selling, trading, gambling. And that's a challenge. It's a real challenge.
Later this year, there's some updated Australian privacy laws coming out, and as part of those laws, businesses will have to actually declare if AI or some sort of sub-processor is involved in decision making. So it's not something that we, as business leaders, need to put our heads in the sand about. Like, we need to actually think about, how AI makes its way into policies and privacy statements and customer contracts, and just like transparency is key here. Like, we need to be able to sort of prove to a relatively certain degree, like, how that decision was arrived at, and if there is, and be transparent about how machines may be influencing it, particularly when it comes to more significant decision making algorithms that might be at play. So creating an image is one thing, and the kind of digital rights and copyright laws and so on around that. But when it comes to decision making, transparency is a massive factor. And leaders just need to start thinking about how they're interacting with their customers in that same way. But really appreciate your take on that, and good to hear the approach that you're and consideration that you've given it.
Yeah, I think that transparency point is really important. Also, I think being respectful of people's rights. When you and I were wearing short pants, we'd remember Napster. You remember Napster, the music sharing platform? That was crazy. It was awesome. But all of a sudden, everyone goes, "This ain't cool. You're just sharing my intellectual property, profiteering from it, and that's not right. Where's my royalties going to go, etc." And I think we're in a bit of a Napster moment at the moment, where people are generating content that's totally harvesting other people's images, content, creativity, and not rewarding them at all. And I think in time there will be much greater respect. We're now in the era of Spotify, and it's matured, and I think that will come.
Yeah, very true. Just thinking about what's coming up in the medium term future, like, what's kind of caught your eye? Like, is there anything that you've come across or heard about, trends or developments where you think will really kind of, not that we haven't shaken things up, but like, what's going to shake us up next? Is there anything you've heard of in that sort of context?
Look, I think the thing I've been learning a lot about lately, or trying to, is what I alluded to before. The emergence of quantum computing. I think this is fascinating. There's all sorts of thinking at the moment that potentially Gen AI pushes quantum back, because obviously our entire computing industry is built on classical mathematics, and Gen AI has enhanced that, which probably means the era of quantum, being a stronger value proposition, has maybe been pushed back. But I think, and also I think there's some demystification that needs to go on. I was chatting to a physicist the other day who was explaining to me exactly, sort of, well, as he had to dumb it down a lot for me, Stuart, in terms of how quantum works. And he said, there's all these people saying that, wait till Gen AI is empowered by quantum computing. And he said that's actually nonsense, because they're completely fundamentally different disciplines.
Right.
One using mathematics, which is augmented by Gen AI, obviously the other using physics. The bit that I alluded to before, I think, is fascinating, though, with quantum, that just like Gen AI has a lot of good, but there's some evil, right? And that's why I think we're seeing the emergence of sovereign AI, et cetera, as well, and our cyber defences are needing to get even more sophisticated. I think that's absolutely true with quantum. Again, you look at things like drug discovery and enhancing the validation of drug targets in say DNA testing and things like that, quantum will be extraordinary. But then that challenge that it's certainly been proven theoretically that quantum will potentially be able to de-encrypt everything that's currently encrypted using RSA encryption. That's scary. So Stuart, we're literally working now with banks because it's probably going to take 7 or 8 years to potentially develop a new form of encryption, right? But quantum's coming in maybe 3 to 5. So if it gets here before you can't respond when it's here. So we've actually got now, Deloitte has launched a quantum cyber readiness business because you've got to be thinking now about cyber and encryption because you've got to have it ready for when quantum lands. And as I noted, that is coming. So that's probably the other one that we're keeping an eye on. And look, I'm sure we're out of time. The other one that fascinates me is space. Again, space was the stuff as kids, watching rockets go to the moon and all this sort of stuff. And now space is the new frontier for, zero gravity manufacturing, spatial, GPS at a level we've never comprehended, solar opportunities, harvesting meteorites, etc. This sort of stuff. So space is probably the other one. Deloitte has launched a global space business. In Asia Pacific, we now have 1,000 space practitioners. Can you believe it? That are working on everything from space law. Who owns the moon? It's an open question. Everything from space law to regulating the use of the satellites, space junk. So they're probably two areas that we're in the field of technology that are sort of just a bit over the horizon, but certainly occupying some of our time.
Yeah, nice. Appreciate the insights. I think seems to be the message. It's like try and kind of project, what's going to happen in 5 or 10 years. Start to think about it now. Start to act on that knowledge and plan for it, and use your kind of, I guess, your visionary thinking and approach to tackle some of those things now to get, to get ready for it. Any other sort of top tips for business leaders who potentially may only just be starting to scratch the surface? Like how would you sort of help them position AI? Say you're a CEO of a large enterprise in Australia. Like how would you be tackling it? What's your kind of top 3 tips, I guess, just to sort of close out the session?
At a personal level, be curious. Never stop learning. Be curious. Have a desire to know and understand enough to embrace. Be liberal. And what I mean by that is afford our employees the opportunity to experiment, to fail fast, fail quick, or to achieve extraordinary things. That would be my second one. And my third one, I would say, is when it comes to AI, is look external and internal. How can you use it to reinvent yourself? So at Deloitte, our own back office, our service delivery models, etc., and then look outside. How can we also make the most of it in the market? So have an external and internal lens, be liberal in terms of affording our people the opportunity to experiment, to pilot, to learn, and then at a personal level, be curious about all things.
Nice. Something there for everyone. Thank you, David. Really appreciate your insights, kind of distilling all that experience and exposure to us. And I hope everyone's learned something, and I'm sure they can take it away and kind of, get something happening in their own boardroom or in their own business ASAP. So appreciate your time and enjoy the rest of your day.
Awesome. Thanks, Stuart. It was a pleasure. Cheers.
Bye.